century AD, bustled with throngs of religious pilgrims during the holy festival of Passover. Thousands of observant Jews crowded into the city to offer sacrifices in the magnificent, gleaming white temple. Originally built by King Solomon, the temple had been greatly expanded and beautified by Herod the Great, who filled in 2 valleys and constructed a massive man-made platform to house the holy buildings.
Herod extended the temple to such an extent that it became the largest enclosed sacrificial space within its time. Visitors to Jerusalem said that as they approached the city, it seemed there was a second sun on the horizon. It would be gleaming with the sunlight.
While in Jerusalem, Jesus spent much of his time on the temple grounds, teaching and praying with his disciples. And it was there that he made a startling prophecy.
As Jesus was making his way out of the temple area, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, look at the huge blocks of stone and the enormous buildings." Jesus said to him, "You see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another. All will be torn down."
Just as Jesus predicted, in 70 AD, less than 40 years after his death, Roman soldiers burned down Jerusalem and toppled Herod's temple. After Islamic forces invaded the city in 638, they built the magnificent Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque atop the Temple Mount, sealing beneath their foundations any remains of the temple Jesus knew.
There's no evidence for Herod's temple to be seen because the Romans dismantled it. And on the place where the temple stood, we have now the Dome of the Rock. Unless that building is taken away and you excavate, there's no way of finding out where the temple stood.
But a few tantalizing clues did manage to survive. In 1838, American biblical scholar Edward Robinson identified an odd piece of protruding masonry as once being part of an arch in Herod's temple. British adventurers James Barclay and Charles Wilson identified more incongruous architectural elements in the following years. But no one could fathom how these disparate pieces all fit together. Then in the 1860s, British military mining expert Charles Warren began the first archaeological excavations around the Temple Mount.
Because from his works, we know that he had to go through 14 courses of stones in order to reach bedrock. 14 courses of stones mean actually about 16 to 18 meters. Let's say about 42, 43 feet all the way down.
From the distinctive Herodian architecture he uncovered, Warren concluded that much of the base of Herod's Temple Mount still stood underground. But it would be nearly 100 years before the shifting political climate would allow another excavation to take place on the site.
In 1967, the Six-Day War broke out, and then the Israelis got control over the old city, and they wanted to explore the Temple Mount and the area surrounding it.
Taking advantage of this unprecedented access, a team of archaeologists began digging beneath the western wall of the Temple Mount. Their subterranean explorations uncovered numerous and fascinating pieces of Herod's temple, many last seen by Charles Warren in the 1800s.
One of the sites which he discovered was this gate. This is one of the 4 gates leading outside of the Temple Mount, and which is mentioned by Josephus Flavius, the Jewish historian of the 1st century AD. In front of it, there was a little piazza, which was made by Herod the Great. The paving slabs of Herod are still visible, and they are shining more than any other stones. This is due to the fact that it was in use for quite a long time.
Excavators point out that this gate was at ground level in the time of Jesus, now buried beneath the sands of time, 2,000 years worth.
This street is the Herodian street, which means Jesus Christ no doubt walked on the slabs which we see here. This is not something in spirituality, it is really the actual physical thing. You are walking along where Christ have walked 2,000 years ago. This is the verification which only archaeology can give, the verification of holy places.
Tunneling deeper, excavators made their most amazing discovery. A series of incredibly massive stones, which they nicknamed the Master Course.
At this point starts a stone. This one is the largest of all. It is over 42 feet long, and you can walk and walk all the time. You can walk along it all the time, and I'm walking along the very same stone. It is exciting to think that all the time we are walking along one stone, all the way down to here. And at this point, this enormous stone stops. After we walked 42 feet along it, it is again 14 feet deep, and it is 11 feet high. The weight of this stone is about 600 metric tons.
But why did Herod's builders quarry these 4 huge stones and place them at this precise location?
They did it because it serves as a counterforce to a vault inside the Temple Mount. There is nowhere else where such enormous stones were used. So it must have had really a very, very important reason to invest all that work to bring all those 4 stones together.
While Bat's crew labored underground, another team of archaeologists meticulously excavated the ground level surrounding the Temple Mount.
In 1967, Professor Benjamin Mazar was put in charge of the excavations to the south and west of the Temple Mount. Relying heavily on Warren's information, he started to open squares and eventually discovered a street complex around the Temple Mount and massive staircases on the south leading up to the 2 southern gates. We can say, well, Jesus walked on these steps or he walked on this street. That is certainly true, and it gives a special sanctity to the place.
Near the great staircases, excavators uncovered evidence of the Roman destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Piles of stones cast down from the high reaches of the Temple Mount were just one reminder of the fiery destruction.
One day I was working there and I was looking up and I saw the outline of a burnt arch in the wall. The Romans must have put a lot of brushwood inside those shops and put a torch to it. The whole thing starts to burn, leaving us the imprint of the inside of the shops. So using those burnt arches, I could reconstruct with a watertight reconstruction how the shops were built along the southern walls. And that was my first, for myself, my major discovery, which got me really hooked on ancient architecture.
By synthesizing his own research with ancient texts and more than 150 years of archaeological data, Dr. Rittmeyer created a series of detailed architectural renderings of the Temple Mount in the time of Jesus. And finally, the pieces of the puzzle all fit.
You see Robinson's Arch with a staircase going down to the Herodian Street. And this is Barclay's Gate, which had a little staircase going up, and inside this gateway is an L-shaped staircase that brings you up to the top of the Temple Mount. This is Wilson's Arch. That was part of a bridge which crossed this Tyropean Valley and went straight to the upper city where all the priests used to live. And this is Warren's Gate. So these are the 4 gates which Josephus tells us were in the Western Wall, and all of them have been found.
But Rittmeyer's work is not without controversy, particularly his contention that the Holy of Holies, the most sacred building in the Jewish temple, stood on the exact spot of the sacred Muslim Dome of the Rock.
The rock is also referred to in the ancient sources as the foundation rock. So I thought, well, that must be the foundation for the temple. And if the rock is larger than the interior of the Holy of Holies, then at least one of the walls must have been built on the rock itself. It took me 20 years to just to come to that conclusion. And then I started to look at the rock, and you can actually see those horizontal areas in the southern part of the rock. They are 10 feet wide, which is exactly the thickness of the wall of the temple. Then looking at photographs, right in the center I found a rectangular depression, and it was exactly the measurements of the Ark of the Covenant, 2.5 by 1.5 cubits. So we know exactly where Solomon's and later Herod's temple stood, where the Dome of the Rock is today.
Rittmeyer's findings do nothing to ease the tensions between Jews and Muslims over control of the Temple Mount.
I'm only interested from an archaeological and architectural point of view where the temple stood. And I stand by my findings, but it is a very explosive issue. We've got to be very careful how we deal with it.
When we continue, scholars call into question the traditions surrounding Jesus' Last Supper.
I don't think there's any archaeological evidence for the present cenacle building standing on the site of the Last Supper.
The night before he died, Scripture tells us that Jesus shared the Passover meal, or Seder, with his disciples. During this Last Supper, Jesus initiated the practice that has come to be known as the Christian Eucharist.
Then taking bread and giving thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body to be given for you. Do this as a remembrance of me."
Knowing that he might die, he wanted a last meal with his disciples. And of course, they would have wanted that to be in the city. And the traditional site is the cenacle on Mount Zion.
While the present-day cenacle room dates only to the Crusader era, many believe that it does mark the spot where the Last Supper took place.
It was a new area that there should be a sort of inn or tavern there, renting rooms for a meal. That's eminently possible.
Then, in 1951, Jacob Pinkerfeld excavated around the base of the cenacle building and discovered large ashlar blocks, which he identified as belonging to a 1st century Herodian synagogue. Further study by a group of Franciscan archaeologists, however, led to the startling conclusion that it was actually the first Jewish Christian house church in Jerusalem and the site of the Last Supper. But some scholars find fault with their conclusions.
People talk about it being Herodian because it's got Herodian building blocks in the walls. However, these Herodian building blocks are reused. They're not the same size and shape. They're scratched, they're cut at the corners. They're clearly reused in a Byzantine wall. So I don't think there's any archaeological evidence for the present cenacle building standing on the site of the Last Supper.
But if Jesus did not celebrate the Last Supper on the site of the cenacle, where did the meal take place? Shockingly, some scholars now believe the answer to that question is nowhere. They claim the event never took place at all.
I think it happened after Jesus. I don't think he institutionalized the Last Supper. When the Last Supper was created by the early church, it brought together the life, bread and wine, and the death, body and blood, in an institution. Personally, I think the institution was absolutely correct. But I don't think it was done by Jesus.
Other scholars vehemently disagree.
I don't think that's true at all. I mean, there's certainly no negative evidence that would totally disprove the Last Supper.
I don't myself believe that there was any teacher within the New Testament period who was influential enough to have given Christianity its central ritual meal, except for Jesus.
To the east of Jerusalem, stands the dark outline of the Mount of Olives. In the 1st century AD, the mountain was covered by olive groves, where the Gospels tell us Jesus and his followers went after their Last Supper together.
When the pilgrims came to Jerusalem, the population of the city tripled, went from about 50,000 to about 150,000. That meant space in the city was at a premium, prices went through the roof, and poor workmen like Jesus of Nazareth could not afford to stay in the city. That's why regularly he goes backwards and forwards over the Mount of Olives.
Leading up from the city to the Mount of Olives is an ancient stairway. In constant use for more than 2,000 years, it is likely that Jesus climbed these very steps for the final time on that fateful night.
Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. He said to his disciples, "Stay here while I go over there and pray." He took along Peter and Zebedee's 2 sons and began to experience sorrow and distress.
Scholars agree that the events surrounding Jesus' agony in the garden and his subsequent arrest took place on the Mount of Olives. But precisely where has long been a subject of debate. The Church of All Nations enshrines a large stone, reputed to be the site where Jesus made his urgent prayers. And a nearby grove of olive trees is often shown as the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus was arrested. However, Joan Taylor believes that this latter tradition is based on a misreading of the Gospels.
The idea that Gethsemane was a garden comes from a conflation of 2 traditions. There's a garden in the Gospel of John, but there's no place called Gethsemane. There's a place called Gethsemane in the Gospel of Mark, but there's no garden. And so what happens in Christian tradition is you get garden in John, Gethsemane in the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, put them together, Garden of Gethsemane.
Since the traditions surrounding the garden only date from the Middle Ages, Dr. Taylor proposes that a better case can be made that the cave known as the Grotto of Gethsemane is the true site of Jesus' arrest.
At the time of year in spring in Jerusalem, it's quite cold, so it's very unlikely that they would have just been falling asleep under some olive trees. So I think that they were in some sort of shelter. You could say that maybe they were in a tent, but, you know, Gethsemane means oil press, so why weren't they in an oil press? It would have been quite natural for people to camp out in this cave that wasn't actually being used for pressing at the time.
Excavations undertaken by Franciscan archaeologists in 1956 seem to support the theory that the grotto was an oil press in the time of Jesus and may have been the site of his arrest.
They found in the cave of Gethsemane channels for water. They found a kind of hole in a wall that would have been perfectly suited for the beam of an oil press to go into.
Trapped within these cold stone walls, Jesus would have had no way to avoid the angry crowd who came for him, or his uncertain future. When we continue, the search for the house of Caiaphas, where Jesus was tried.
It's the largest mansion ever discovered in the whole of the land of Israel.
Those who had apprehended Jesus led him off to Caiaphas, the high priest. The chief priest with the whole Sanhedrin were busy trying to obtain false witness against Jesus so that they might put him to death.
Today, several sites in Jerusalem claim to be the location of the high priest Caiaphas' house, where the trial of Jesus is said to have taken place. The most famous is the Church of St. Peter in Gallicantu, which houses magnificent stone cellars, purported to be the prison in which Caiaphas held Jesus. But it is a claim most scholars now believe to be untrue.
Peter in Gallicantu was the house of a rather wealthy person in the 1st century, but I don't believe for a minute that it was the house of the high priest. The high priest was the equivalent to, today, a prime minister in a troubled area, and anyone who puts his palace halfway down a hill is silly, to be very polite about it. Anyone higher up can throw stones at you, for example.
A more appropriate home for a 1st century high priest might be the palatial mansion, which sits atop a hill overlooking the Temple Mount.
Now, this is definitely the elite. This is elite living for the elite of the society, which in that period was the priestly class.
Excavated by Naaman Avogat in the 1970s, the palatial mansion provides a virtual window into the opulent lifestyles of high priests in the time of Jesus.
I'm standing next to a mosaic which fills the floor space of this room. These geometric designs were typical of what we call Jewish art of the period. A Jewish ritual law does not allow the presentation of figurative items. They cannot be animals or anything that is of God's creation. So what would be shown would be simple geometric designs, but really beautiful examples of art of the period.
Excavators marvel at the unique features found throughout the palatial mansion that attest to the priestly rank of the ancient inhabitants.
It's the largest mansion ever discovered in the whole of the land of Israel. But what makes it so special is that there were 4 mikvaot built into that building itself. Now, that is highly unusual. At the most, you will find 1 mikveh in one building.
We've now come into one of the mikvaot, one of the ritual baths that were one of the features of these houses. This is the largest ritual bath of this house. We've come into one of the entrances, and that's very important. There are 2 entrances to this bathhouse, allowing the impure to come down into the bath and the pure to exit through the bathhouse as they leave. And this would have provided the use for these priests who were working on a day-to-day basis in the temple.
While the palatial mansion provides an invaluable chronicle of upper-class life in the time of Jesus, researchers still wonder if this is truly the house of Caiaphas.
It's probably a mansion that belonged to one of the high priestly families, possibly the family of Caiaphas, but nearby a house was found, quarters for a servant, probably, but the name Katros is found inscribed on a stone. That's the name of another high priestly family, and if that's the servants' quarters, just a stone's throw away from this mansion, then perhaps the family of Katros, not Caiaphas or Annas or someone else, lived in that mansion.
By far, the most intriguing possibility for the true location of the house of Caiaphas can be found in the shadow of the Church of the Dormition. The ruins, excavated there in the 1970s, seem to best fit the location of Caiaphas' house, described in the ancient texts. But the site also contains some surprisingly unpriestly artwork.
Excavations in the 1970s, which were conducted by Megan Broschi, unearthed these wonderful houses full of frescoes. And the surprising thing was that some of these frescoes didn't have what was expected, geometric designs and so forth, but depictions of wreaths and birds and little figs and all sorts of scenes which you'd expect in a sumptuous mansion in Pompeii, but not in Jerusalem, because of the Jewish prohibition against the graven image.
But who would be so brazen as to deliberately flaunt graven images?
Either we're dealing with aristocrats adapting themselves to a foreign way of life, or you had high priests who had a different kind of perception. But this is sheer speculation, because we have no evidence to link these structures with the traditional House of Caiaphas.
While archaeologists can only speculate about Caiaphas' life, a chance discovery in November of 1990 provides fascinating evidence about his death. During road construction south of Jerusalem, workers accidentally unearthed a burial cave. When archaeologist Zvi Greenhut arrived on the scene, he had no great expectations.
To enter to this tomb, it was first nothing special. I mean, the architecture of the tomb and the arrangement and the pattern and everything like that was very, very typical. But then I met the ossuaries.
Ossuaries were a common feature in first-century Jewish tombs. After bodies were allowed to decompose on rock benches in the crypt, the bones were gathered up and placed in these decorative limestone chests.
I met the ossuaries and I found that they were inscribed. And this is a rare phenomenon. And it took another week or 10 days to clean them and to try to decipher what's going on. And suddenly it was deciphered, and suddenly it was the name Joseph, the son of Caiaphas.
Joseph, of course, is not a rare name, but Caiaphas is an extremely rare name, and in fact, the only person we know of around this time period with that name is mentioned in the Gospels as participating in the trial and crucifixion of Jesus.
Inside the communal ossuary, Greenhood discovered the bones of 6 individuals, including those of a man nearly 60 years old. Could this ossuary hold the actual remains of the high priest Caiaphas?
As it turns out, the age of one of the skeletons in the box does match the age of our Caiaphas. So I would take that to mean that, in all probability, we are dealing here with the ossuary of Caiaphas.
But not everyone agrees. The inscriptions are crudely written in ancient Hebraic script, leaving them open to alternate interpretations.
Some think it's Caiapha, and if it is, then it's probably Caiaphas. However, that last name probably shouldn't be pronounced Caiapha. It's probably Kofa or Kufa. We probably, therefore, don't have the ossuary of the high priest. Well, the reason I'm doubtful about that, too, is that the crypt in which it was found was not very ornate, and we would expect the crypt of a high priestly family to be very ornate.
While Greenhood admits that this seeming inconsistency nags at him as well, he stands by the results of his dig.
There is no final proof. The debate should go on, and this is the way of the science. But it's okay. I am, again, positively assured that this is the name.
When we continue, archaeologists uncover concrete evidence of Jesus' next step towards the cross.
They found a huge pavement, which was immediately identified by the excavator as the Lithostraton, the place where Jesus was judged by Pilate.
Having determined that Jesus should be put to death, Caiaphas handed him over to Pontius Pilate for execution. Despite his prominence in the gospel stories, however, little was known about Pontius Pilate outside the biblical texts. That changed in 1961, when Italian archaeologists working at Caesarea Maritima uncovered a stone inscription that read, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. Though small in size, the inscription had huge implications.
This is the very first time that we have the name of Pontius Pilatus, and the only time that we have the name of Pontius Pilatus on an inscription that dates from his period of time.
What's more important about it is that there were scholarly quibbles between Pilate's exact title. Was he a prefect or was he a procurator? And the inscription settled those quibbles. He was, in fact, a prefect, which had more power than a procurator.
As a prefect, he could sentence people to death, like he did with Jesus.
The Gospels tell us that Jesus appeared before Pilate at his praetorium, or military headquarters. Over the course of Christian history, this praetorium came to be associated with the fortress Antonia. Named after Mark Antony, the four-towered stronghold stood atop a hill overlooking the Temple Mount before being destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. For centuries, the only remains of Pilate's praetorium thought to exist was an arch called Ecce Homo.
The Ecce Homo arch was associated with the Passion of Jesus about the 14th or 15th century. Ecce Homo, the words mean, behold the man, and so the Ecce Homo became the place where Jesus was judged by Pilate.
In 1857, Father Mary Alphonse Ratisbonne purchased the area surrounding the Ecce Homo arch and began constructing a convent for the Sisters of Sion.
Inside this building, they found a huge pavement, which was immediately identified by the excavator as the Lithostraton, which is mentioned in the Gospels. You see, the place where Jesus is judged is so important that it is mentioned both in Greek, Lithostraton, the pavement, and in Hebrew, Gabbatha.
Clearing the pavement, workers found strange etched game boards and toppled columns. Father Ratisbonne became convinced that they had uncovered the paved inner courtyard of the Antonia fortress, where Pilate made his final judgment on Jesus. The discovery instantly made the Convent of the Sisters of Sion one of the most popular stops for Christian pilgrims visiting Jerusalem. Then, in the late 1960s, new studies by archaeologist Father Pierre Benoit raised some disturbing questions about the Ecce Homo arch.
When Père Benoit first studied the arch, he disagreed that it was the entrance to the fortress Antonia. And he argued very strongly that it was a triumphal arch of the 2nd century AD that was put up by the Emperor Hadrian when he destroyed Jerusalem and in its place erected the Roman city of Aelia Capitolina.
Many clues contained in the arch seem to support Father Benoit's redating.
What is left of the arch is quite a lot. First of all, we can see here the main arch, and the typical 2nd century AD triumphal arches is always with 3 gates, two small gates which flank one big one. Here you can see the big one, which continues into the Monastery of the Sisters of Zion, also one of the smaller flanking arches. You can see that when the Monastery of the Sisters of Zion was built, they put here the inscription Via Dolorosa. As we go to the other side from here, you can see the nicer face of the arch, and you can see 2 stones over the arch, which are original Roman. On the left one, the one which is closer to the monastery, you can still see some letters which indicate the date, which is late 2nd century AD.
In ensuing years, a more thorough study of the famous arch helped to further clarify its age and function.
Yves Bloom recognized that this was not a triumphal arch, but it was more likely to be a city gate of the 1st century. And so now people think that it is a gate in the so-called 3rd wall of Jerusalem, which was erected, about 40-41 AD, about 10 years after the Passion.
Benoit dated the so-called Lithostraton pavement to the same time period as the Ecce Homo arch, and determined that neither was part of the Antonia fortress. Based on clues taken from ancient historical texts, most historians now believe that the Praetorium, where Jesus appeared before Pilate, was not located in the Antonia fortress, but in Herod's palace.
There's no doubt about it that it's the logical place for the trilogies to have taken place, not in Antonia fortress, which was a kind of barracks.
According to Josephus, Herod the Great built a magnificent palace at the western edge of Jerusalem. After his death, this palace was confiscated and pressed into service as the regional headquarters for the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. Could this have been the location of the Gabbatha pavement, where Pilate condemned Jesus to death?
Gabbatha means the high point, and used absolutely, it is the highest point in the city That's why I think most scholars would argue that Gabbatha means the citadel today near Jaffa Gate, which was the site of the palace of the Jewish kings, which was then occupied by Pontius Pilate, and that the pavement then is to be sought in the citadel area around the Jaffa Gate.
For researchers hoping to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, however, Herod's palace proved as elusive as the Antonia fortress. The site of Herod's palace was covered by the massive 14th century Muslim fort known as the Citadel. How could excavators hope to find any remnants of the palace when it lay beneath the citadel? Surprisingly, the answer turned out to be right before their very eyes. In 1894, British archaeologists dug around the base of the citadel and determined it was constructed atop older remains. Further excavating the same area in 1934, C.N. Johns made the astounding discovery that not only was the citadel built on earlier structures, but part of it was actually comprised of old ruins, a unique feature that can still be seen today.
Behind me, we have one of the great examples of Herodian architecture that's left in the city. This is one of the towers that was built by Herod in the city of Jerusalem. We know from, again, the works of Josephus Flavius, that in the city of Jerusalem there were 3 great towers. Later on, these towers were incorporated into later buildings to include the whole of the citadel area.
The identification of the Herodian Tower provided an important clue in the search for the king's palace.
The palace of Herod was located next to the 3 towers. Those 3 towers are on the site of the present citadel of Jerusalem, and we're now on the site right next to that site.
In 2001, John Seligman of the Israel Antiquities Authority unveiled for the first time the results of an amazing new excavation. Tunneling beneath an ancient Ottoman prison, excavators finally uncovered evidence of the grand palace of Herod the Great.
We're now standing in a recent excavation we've been conducting in which finds have been made which we think belong to that time. This great wall which I'm standing next to is part of the terracing that Herod built over here at the site to build his palace. One of the great parts of the aspects of Herod's work was the building of large platforms on which to build his palaces.
Mimicking the construction of the Temple Mount, Herod used these massive retaining walls to form a man-made platform on which to build his palace.
Unfortunately, we are standing outside his palace. I'm now standing in the area between the retaining walls and the city wall of Jerusalem. The actual palace would have been on the other side of this wall, and that is still waiting for a next generation of archaeologists to find in their future excavations.
Until that time, researchers continue to comb the area for evidence that might link the site to the gospel stories.
You've got to imagine a flight of steps where the rocks are here, leading up.
Amazingly, archaeologist Shimon Gibson now believes he can pinpoint the exact location of the high ground, or Gabbatha, where Pontius Pilate interrogated Jesus.
We're here on the western side of the old city of Jerusalem, and as you can see, the citadel is here on the north. Behind the wall here was the palace of Herod the Great, and I like to imagine that this is a spot that perhaps Jesus was brought up in order to be at this trial in front of Pontius Pilate. Okay, this is one of the steps, and look how it's worn away at this spot and over here as well. It's been worn away by the people climbing these steps. You can see if I put my foot in it, you see how it sort of fits perfectly. So these are the steps that Pontius Pilate would have climbed in order to reach the palace, the praetorium. And let's go in. There would have been a gate above my head here. Of course, it's not here now, because all we have are the foundations of that gate. But it would have led directly into a paved area. Of course, it's now covered with this nice green lawn. But in those days, there was a paved courtyard extending up to the inner wall, and you can see that inner wall over there. And then there was another flight of steps over here leading up to the place where I think the tribunal, the chair of the tribunal would have been, where Pontius Pilate would have sat in order to think about what he was going to do with this rascal, this problematic person named Jesus.
Every Friday afternoon, Christian pilgrims gather to take part in the Way of the Cross, or Via Dolorosa, which commemorates Jesus' final journey from the traditional site of the Praetorium to Golgotha, where he was crucified. In light of recent archaeological discoveries, some are beginning to question the accuracy of this route.
The present Via Dolorosa has absolutely no claim to be historical. It starts from the wrong point, and of course a number of the episodes on the Via Dolorosa have no basis in the New Testament, like Veronica wiping his face, for example. These were the development of popular piety in which historical certitude had no place at all.
Despite the scientific evidence against it, however, thousands of pilgrims continue to take part in the Way of the Cross every week.
The results of scholarship have no impact at all on the traditions of piety in Jerusalem. I mean, the Via Dolorosa is established by faith, not by history. But what I think would be wrong would be for academics to say, this is the wrong place, therefore you can't go there. You see. Because places, however tawdry, however fake, they have been venerated by people of great courage and great faith. They have a claim on our human sensitivity, even though they may be historically wrong. And so I would never discourage people from going to such places.
In ancient days, a group of books